Welcome to CEO Money. I'm Michael Yorba. Thanks for joining with us. My guest is Josh Long, Bottleneck Breakthrough Group. All right, we're going to talk about doing business and, get stuck with the same bottlenecks, or are they all different? We're going to break through this, and we've all faced it. So, Josh, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Michael. Glad to be here.
All right, my pleasure. A little background on Bottleneck Breakthrough Group, and then I want to dive right into this.
Yeah. So I've been doing consulting for about a decade, worked with a lot of great thought leaders out there from Dan Kennedy to Jay Abraham, and was able to get a really front and center view to small businesses and the struggles they have. And there's a lot of the big idea guys that are about breakthrough ideas and blue sky, I call it. And then there's a lot of the system guys that are like, Michael Gerber, Sam Carpenter, that talk about creating the systems in a business, and that gets really boring for a lot of small business owners. So of course you got these two camps, and I saw both of them being super valuable. And when I started digging in with clients, those that would just trust me to do my thing in their business, we'd find that there were some systems that we could apply some big idea pieces to that would solve their bottlenecks. And just going from bottleneck to bottleneck unlocks consistent, sustainable growth. So that's how we came up with the name Bottleneck Breakthrough Group. And my book, Bottleneck Breakthrough, by that title, is just walking through my process of going into businesses and finding and fixing the next bottleneck that's preventing growth.
What are some of the common bottlenecks you can share with us?
Yeah, so I found revenue plateaus that are common throughout small businesses. They start, first one really kicks in about $500,000, but the most common one's right at $1 million. And that $1 million bottleneck, the number one most common thing is that the owner is doing everything. They're closing the business, they're the rainmaker, but then they're also managing the fulfillment team. And so they get to this point where they run out of time and they start throttling themselves on the rainmaking because they know the more they close, the more they're going to have to manage fulfillment. And so the primary solution there is to develop an operations manager, a little Napoleon that's going to stay back at the office or the factory and keep cracking the whip, and allow that owner to go continue to be the great rainmaker, because most entrepreneurs are great rainmakers and they're their best salesperson. And so that is the most common bottleneck for all small businesses.
Okay, how about biggest surprises that the owners seem to pump into all this time while they're fighting with that plateau?
The biggest surprise is just that they get caught up in thinking that they have to do it all themselves. They don't understand the transition from being an entrepreneur to being an organizational leader. And so that management shift, right? Like that's the biggest shift for all small business owners to wrestle with, because in small business, management's a 4-letter word, right? Like they all think it means bureaucracy. It means sloth. It's what the Fortune 500, it's what the companies they quit to go start their own thing were buried with, was all that management and bureaucracy. But at the end of the day, an organization requires organizing of activities, and that comes down to management. And so I've got a handful of little hacks that I teach my clients, because management is a necessary evil in their mind, and nobody's paying me to teach them how to manage. They all come to me for growth, for new revenue. A lot of times that's related to marketing, but management becomes the biggest bottleneck really fast. So there's a handful of hacks that I talk about in the book about how to view management as not a tedious thing, as not a micromanaging thing, but as an organizational leadership thing.
And this is kind of an obvious question, but why don't these problems get solved on their own with current management in place? There's a little catch and a little hiccup in there. I'm sure that's why they're running into this, but bring that out for us.
Yeah, I think it's essentially the Peter Principle of some capacity. That the Peter Principle says that people get promoted to their level of incompetence. So the classic example is that the top sales guy gets slated to be what? Sales manager, right?
Right, yeah.
So, or sales guy, sales gal, whatever, salesperson, it gets slated to be a sales manager. Well, that salesperson may have been crushing it. They may have been 500% more productive than the average salesperson, but they may not be able to manage or coach, if we put it into sports terms. So then they become a sales manager. They don't succeed. Their team flounders under them. they get fired, right? Because they're not going to take a demotion. Nobody does that. Go from sales manager back to sales rep or sales person. And so you just essentially promoted and fired your greatest salesperson. And so on the ownership side, it's the same pattern, except you're not going to get fired because you're your own boss. And so you get to this point where the business grows to your level of incompetence of leadership. And that, to me, is the real answer. Other answers that I had a client talk with a guy yesterday, and he said that some of the things I was rattling off, he was just asking me what I do. And he said, it's like you've bugged my office. I said, everybody struggles with this. And he said, I know what I'm supposed to do. I just don't do it. And it's because it's difficult. It's not novel. It's not stimulating. It's not new or fun. And so that's where a lot of entrepreneurs, because we all have ADD, right? Like that's the classic entrepreneurial trait. So we like stimulation. We like novelty. And when we get to that difficult issue of confronting dysfunctional staff or changing comp plans because the organization's changed, or dealing with getting to the bottom of a tech issue when you're not technologically inclined, like all of these things are just stuff most owners would rather avoid. And so they're making enough money. Their motivation to get past this bottleneck isn't that great at times. And they can feel really isolated. I mean, when they are so used to having all the answers and so used to being the wizard behind the screen that solves everything, and now they run into something that they feel out of their depth, a lot of times it's really hard to admit that they need help. So I get a lot of clients that start viewing me more as a therapist and counselor than consultant, because we dig into some of this mindset stuff too. I mean, it's all related.
I can see how that would happen. Then would that put guys like Bill Gates or like Steve Jobs, who started from very meager beginnings, into the exception to the rule? Why? Of
course, 100%. Yeah, they're the unicorns, right? Like. And I talk about in my book, in the mindset section at the end, I talk about Gates, and there's a guy named Gary Kildall who actually Gates referred IBM to, because he had an operating system before Gates did, and IBM came to Gates and knew what Gates was doing in the tech space, in the software space, and IBM went down to Pacific Grove, little tiny town near Monterey in California, where Gary Kildall had his office. And 3 executives from San Jose drove down. Kildall blew them off and went for a flight in his little plane and snubbed his nose to them. So IBM went back to Gates and said, Kildall won't meet with us. What can you do? So then the story of Gates going and getting the operating system and working it out. They went back to Kildall after they signed their license agreement with Gates and said, hey, we'd like to come out with both options. Well, Kildall, again, snubbed his nose at them, did a deal, but felt his software, his operating system was superior, so he charged them more for it. So IBM had to release it to the marketplace. Gates' version was cheaper than Kildall's version. So guess what people did? They bought Gates' version. He made money. Kildall ended up dying in a bar years later, after drinking in a bar fight. And here's an opportunity, right? Like, this guy was eons ahead of Bill Gates. The timing was right. He had a better operating system. Think of the billions of dollars businesses would have saved by using a better operating system through the 80s instead of having to rely on Microsoft's harebrained solution. And so that's just an example of somebody had the right timing, had the right opportunity, but their mindset got in the way. And Bill Gates comes in behind it. And yes, he is a great leader. He's a great organizational leader. Right place, right time, brilliant guy. And so I think the business books and business literature out there of saying, be like Bill Gates, be like Steve Jobs, be like all these guys, Mark Zuckerberg or whatever, are completely unreplicable. I mean, those guys are cults of personalities. They're so unique in their leadership style. And the average small business owner just is not going to step into leadership like that. Bezos right now, right? Like, I mean, he's obviously got the world by the tail at Amazon. So I think those are useful to pull some insights from, but you're not going to copy those guys.
No, but you can work on to emulate some of their patterns to kind of like work with what you're working with.
Exactly. And the number one thing those guys all have that most small business owners don't have is the ability to confront massively, like their willingness to confront dysfunction. They're just not afraid of it. They can be accused as being narcissistic or sociopathic or some of those other unsavory traits, but they confront and they don't avoid it. They don't run away from it.
Got it. All right, that is a lot for this session. I appreciate you being on the show, and I want to see if we can come back later and we can dive into more insights as you bring them up, little chapters out of the book where you talk to people, and then we've got for instance, this conversation happened and this is the result. You know what I mean? Definitely.
I love making it more applicable, as clear examples as possible. So I'd love to do that, Michael.
Thanks, Josh. All right, you've been watching CEO Money with Michael Yorba. Don't forget, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.